right? Anti-Semitic, which means they hate the Jews, that they hate Judaism. And this is a propaganda campaign launched against Islam and Muslims, which when you study our scriptures and study our history, it becomes very clear that this is a false message, that this is not true at all. Firstly, this has been used in our times as a deflection. Whenever we try to point out the crimes of the Zionist regime, the deflection is, oh, you are anti-Semitic. No, we are not anti-Semitic, but you are doing criminal actions, and those criminal actions need to be pointed out, and they need to be, justice needs to be done in some way or another. So understand that this is a word that they use to deflect people from criticizing them in any way. But let's actually study and analyze what does Islam teach on this topic, because this is something that many Muslims might not be aware of. What does Islam actually tell us in terms of its teachings and its history on Judaism? Well, to begin, in Islam, the Jews are considered part of Ahlul Kitab. Right? What is Ahlul Kitab? Kitab meaning the Bible. Ahlul Kitab, the people who follow the Bible, who follow the book, the people of the book. This refers to the Jews and Christians. And what this means is, in Islam, even though we consider the Jews and Christians to be disbelievers, we do recognize that we have a shared tradition. That they believe in certain prophets that we believe in, they believe in certain scriptures that we believe in, and that we have some commonalities in our beliefs compared to other religions. So if you compare the beliefs of Jews and Muslims, and you'll find that there are commonalities. Both believe in one God, both believe in Adam and Eve, in prophets, in books, in the Torah, in Moses, in David, and Solomon. There are commonalities there, and this is why they were given the status of Ahlul Kitab, which is a higher status than the other disbelievers. They still consider disbelievers for rejecting Jesus and Muhammad, the two prophets of Allah, who they consider to be false prophets. So they're still considered disbelievers for that. But it's a separate category where they were given certain rights in the Muslim world. Another important point to look at when you want to understand the history of Islam and Judaism is to understand the history of Christianity and Judaism. Because if you don't know how the Christians treated the Jews historically, you cannot appreciate what the Muslims did for the Jews historically. So before Islam, the most dominant civilization in the world was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, at that point in time, was a Christian empire. And the Christian Roman Empire was really anti-Semitic. They genuinely hated the Jews, and for a very obvious reason. Theologically, right? The Christians being honest about their religion, theologically, the Jews killed their God, right, in their theology. So obviously, they have this hatred for each other. And with the Christians being the dominant empire and the Jews being a minority in that empire, what ended up happening was a lot of oppression. An oppression that systematically went on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That there is a long history of Jews being persecuted by Christian empires. And one of the best examples of this was Jerusalem. Jerusalem, when it was conquered by the Romans, they renamed it to Ilia Constantinia. In Arabic it was called Ilia, and they had banned the Jews from the land completely. The Jews were completely banned from their holy land by the Christians. So why am I bringing all this up? To appreciate what Islam did and what Islam brought for the Jewish nations. When Umar radiallahu anhu conquered Constantinople, when he conquered Jerusalem, when Umar radiallahu anhu conquered Jerusalem, he put together a treaty that gave the Christians and the Jews their rights, because Islam recognized that this land, Jerusalem, is a holy land to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. See, this is a big difference. Historically, whenever the Christians were in charge of Jerusalem, they persecuted the Muslims and the Jews. And now that the Jews are in charge of Jerusalem, we see what they do to the Muslims and Christians. But whenever the Muslims were in charge of Jerusalem, the understanding that this is a holy land to all three religions, there was that religious freedom given to both the Jews and the Christians. So when Umar radiallahu anhu conquered Jerusalem, Firstly, he preserved the rights of the Christians that have been living there, and the descendants of those Christians continue to live there right until today, and there's a fear of them being wiped out in the current genocide as well. But those Christians, their rights were preserved by Umar, and their churches were preserved, and their heritage was preserved, based on the teachings of Islam. Because who understood Islam better than Umar? You know, if anyone comes today and says that what he did was not Islamic, do you understand Islam better than the second Khalifa of Islam? The one about whom the Prophet ﷺ said, if there had to be a prophet after me, it would have been Umar. This is the man who understood Islam best from that generation. And when he became the ruler of Jerusalem, not only did he preserve the rights of the Christians, but he welcomed the Jews back into Jerusalem. That for the first time in hundreds of years, they were allowed to do their religious pilgrimage to their Holy Land. They were allowed to go back there. In the beginning, it was just for pilgrimage, because they didn't want to upset the Christian residents too much. But over time, more and more rights were given to the Jews until they were integrated back into the community of Jerusalem. And they lived there from that time right until now. There are people who have been living there of Jewish background. But the history of Islam and its kind treatment to the Jewish nations is not restricted to Jerusalem. You can study any Muslim civilization in the world where they were Jews, and you will find that the Muslims consistently, based on the teachings of Islam, based on the teachings of our scriptures, they treated the Jews with justice. Because what Islam teaches us is that in a Sharia land, yes, in a Sharia land, Muslims are number one because they follow Islam. But the non-Muslims who pay the jizya, they have freedom of religion. They can live in peace, worship in peace, follow their religions in peace. And this was applied equally to the Jews as well. They weren't discriminated against. They were given the same freedom of religion as the other religions. And we see the best examples of this when Muslims ruled over Europe, with the empires of Andalusia and the Ottoman Empire. Both of these empires, and Andalusia was in Europe, it was Spain. Spain was a Muslim land for 700 years. And the Ottoman Empire at one point in time ruled over quite a bit of what is today the European Western world. The countries like Greece and a large part of what is now Russia used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And in these lands, again, we see how the Muslims treated the Jews better than anyone else. In fact, I would go as far as to say that Islam and the Islamic Empire is the reason that Judaism survived and thrived all these years. If it wasn't for Islam, if it wasn't for the existence of an Islamic empire, if it wasn't for the rights that Islam gave to all of the people of the book, the Jews may have been wiped out by the Christians. Because there were many points in time where they had nowhere to go except to the Muslim lands. And nobody was willing to help them besides the Muslims. And nobody was willing to open their doors for them besides the Muslims. And they recognized that the Muslims were their allies. And for many years throughout our history, there were strong alliances between Jews and Muslims to such an extent that when the Christians used to invade Al-Andalus, when the Christians used to invade Spain to take it over, there would be Jews in the Muslim army fighting jihad in defense of Spain. There were even Jews who were leaders of the Muslim army in the jihad. Think about that. There is a jihad between a Muslim nation and a Christian nation, and the Jews are part of the Mujahideen, even though they weren't Muslims. But this was their land. These were the people protecting their rights. They were willing to fight for them. They were willing to die for them. And think about this. In Islam, Ahlul Kitab don't have to fight. They pay the jizya, and in exchange for the jizya, the Muslims will protect them. So they don't even have to fight. There's no military obligation upon Ahlul Kitab in a Muslim nation, because that jizya is in exchange for protection. But despite that, they still wanted to fight to defend that land, because they understood the Muslims gave them their rights in that land. When Al-Andalus fell to the Christians, and they were massacring the Muslims and the Jews, and forcing them to convert to Christianity, the Ottoman Empire, which was coming up around the same time, they opened their doors to the Jews. And they said that anyone who is persecuted by the Christians in that land, they can come live peacefully in our land. We won't disturb them. And the Ottoman Empire had a very beautiful system that allowed Judaism and Christianity to flourish. This is called the Millat system. Millat means religion. The millat system was basically, they took the Islamic concept that if you pay the jizya, we let you live in peace and practice as you wish. They took this and they formalized it. And they formalized it in a way where you now had Christian villages and Jewish villages that operated entirely on their scriptures. So if you visited the Ottoman Empire, which was the dominant Muslim empire of that time, you would come to a village that was entirely Christian, and where the priests would rule that empire by their book and by their law. And you would come to another town that was entirely Jewish, and they would live by the Torah, and they would rule by the Torah, and they would even apply criminal law based on the Torah. That was the level of freedom of religion that Islam gave them. And one of the best examples of how well the Muslims treated the Jews is the type of people that came out from the Muslim empire from amongst the Jews. The best example from Al-Andalus itself came about the greatest philosopher and theologian in the history of Judaism, Moses Maimonides. Moses Maimonides, who is seen as the central figure of shaping modern theology in Judaism. Someone who until today the Jews follow his writings when it comes to their beliefs, when it comes to their laws, when it comes to their daily understanding of Islam, of Judaism, they follow Moses Maimonides. He grew up in Al-Andalus, and he went through the madrasa system of Al-Andalus. The madrasa system in those days is not what we think of today, right? Today when we think of madrasa, we think of, the maktab you go to after school. No. Madrasa historically was equal to a university. It was a university where you could go and study anything and become a professional, but you also learn the religion in the process. So he went through the madrasa system. He became the greatest Jewish scholar, not that of that generation, but of any generation, thriving in a Muslim empire. And he even became a close associate of Salahuddin Ayyubi himself. And this is the level of freedom and the level of respect that we gave to other religions in our empire. So when people come and they say things like, oh, you Muslims hate the Jews. No, we don't hate any specific group of disbelievers more than any other group, right? We don't have any specific hatred for a specific group of people. Not based on race, not based on religion, nothing like that. What we hate is the genocide that is going on. What we hate is the apartheid that's going on. What we hate is these colonizers who have taken over Muslim lands and who are butchering people and who are harming people. This is what we hate. Jews lived in that land from the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab right until now, and we've never had a problem with it. We've never had a problem with them living in that land. Our problem is with the oppression that they are committing to our people. So we must be very careful. People are trying to flip the script. They're trying to make us look like the bad guys. You need to be very careful when you're talking to people to get them to realize the reality. The reality here is not that it's Muslims versus Jews. It is the rightful people of that land versus the oppressors. That is the correct framing for what is going on in that part of the world. We ask Allah to grant us the correct understanding. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. One of the points that the enemies raise to try and make Islam look anti-Semitic is they point to the treatment of the Jews of Medina in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, particularly the harsh punishment that was carried out against Banu Qurayza, and they try to frame this as hatred of Jews and a genocide of Jews, and this is historically inaccurate. If you know what happened at that time and why it happened, you will see it's nothing to do with Judaism, it's nothing to do with their race or their religion. It was all to do with treason, with people breaking a peace treaty, with people violating their agreement with another group. So let's just go through this history very briefly, because this keeps coming up. People keep saying, oh, your prophet hated the Jews and he killed the Jews. No, that's not what happened, right? That's not what happened. The Prophet ﷺ and his government executed the traitors. He'd have done it regardless of what those traitors' religion were. Even those traitors were Muslims, they would have got the same punishment. It was about treason, it wasn't about race or religion. So what happens is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam moved to Yathrib, which we now know as Medina. And Yathrib at that time was not a city like how we see it today. Today Medina is this beautiful city, right? When he arrives in Yathrib, it is an oasis. And in this oasis, there are a group of different villages and fortresses. So the Aus live in one village, the Khazraj live in another village, and the Jews have 3 different fortresses and a village. And really the majority of the people there were Jewish. And they moved to that land because they were expecting the next prophet to come from that land. That's why they settled it. So the Jews lived in these fortresses, they ran the marketplace, they were the dominant people of that region. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam moves to Medina, one of the first things he does is he makes peace treaties with each of the Jewish tribes. And these have been documented. You can go back and read the history books, read for yourself the details. It's a very fair peace treaty. A very fair peace treaty that says that we are sharing a land, we are neighbors to each other, we follow different religions, but we will protect each other, we will not ally with people against each other, we will not betray each other, we will have each other's backs. Right? If you're living in the desert in Arabia in those days, you need to have each other's backs. There's always wars, there's always tribal conflicts, there's always people trying to take over. So they signed a very decent treaty, a very sensible treaty, right? That we're sharing this land, let's protect each other, let's have each other's backs. And all of the Jewish tribes signed that treaty. But what happens over the next 2 years, one by one, those tribes violate the treaty. One by one, they violate the treaty. Now, when there is a peace treaty between nations, and someone violates the treaty, what do you do? What do you do? Do you just let it go? If you think you just let it go, you don't understand politics. You don't understand the consequences of letting something like that go. The consequences could be drastic. The consequences could be a massacre in the middle of the night. It could mean them repeating this over and over again. Violation of peace treaties is something that requires a harsh punishment. And so we see there was a degree of different punishments carried out depending on how badly the treaty was violated. So for 2 of the groups, they were exiled. They were kicked out of Medina. That was their punishment. For a 3rd group, there was a siege. The whole land was taken over, right? It was only the 4th group. This is the one that people find controversial, but when you understand the politics of that time, it's not controversial at all. The Banu Qurayza, 500 of their warriors were executed. 500 of their warriors were executed. This is historically proven that at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, 500 warriors of Banu Qurayza were executed for treason. Now, again, framing is important. How do people frame this today? They say, oh, your prophet massacred 500 innocent Jews. No, he did not massacre 500 innocent Jews. His government executed 500 traitors who happened to be Jews. Because what happened? The battle of Ahzab took place. The people of Medina were surrounded by enemy tribes who wanted to destroy them. And at that moment, where the Muslims were literally surrounded by enemies, and they had to rely on their allies within the city for help, at that moment, the Banu Qurayza decided, let's break our peace treaty and let's attack the Muslims from the inside while they are weak. At the most difficult moment possible, at the moment where violating the peace treaty could lead to the entire community being wiped out, they chose to violate the treaty. And they started harassing the Muslims. But the Muslims pushed back and they realized they made a mistake and they went back into their fortress. But the point is, they broke a peace treaty in the middle of a war and put the entire community in danger. And if you understood the laws of that time, across all the religions in that land, they knew what they were doing. Even before breaking the treaty, they knew if we do this, we will probably be executed. Because they understood this is the law of the land. You break a peace treaty during war times, you're going to be executed. And by the way, right till today, in most countries around the world, if people are traitors, if people commit treason, there's a death penalty for it. That still applies, right? This isn't some ancient thing. That still applies today. There's a death penalty for treason. And that's what happened. These 500 men betrayed their community in the middle of a war. We're trying to destroy it from the inside in the middle of the war. So when the war was over, they were executed for their crime. It's very important that we understand things in the proper context. People will say, your prophet murdered Jews. That's not exactly what happened. He didn't kill them because they were Jews. Rather, the government of that time executed criminals for treason. and their race and their religion is irrelevant. It's the crime that they were executed for, not their race or religion. So be very careful again how people frame these stories to try and make Muslims look bad and to try and make Islam look bad. The other story that they bring up to try and make Islam look anti-Semitic is a prophecy about the end times. So there's a prophecy about the end times that towards the end of time, and we all know the prophecy, towards the end of time, there will be a war between Jews and Muslims, and there will be stones and trees that will talk and tell the Muslims, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. So they say, oh, look at how anti-Semitic your religion is. Trees and stones are telling people to kill the Jews. Again, prophecies are a prediction about what's going to happen. They are not a judgment on an entire group, right? If we had to say that towards the end of times there'd be a war between Muslims and Romans, that is another prophecy. There'll be a war between Muslims and Romans. Does that mean Muslims are anti-Roman and they want to kill all the Romans? No, it just means at a certain point in time this is going to happen, right? It's not a judgment on every group until that time. It means at that time something will happen, will cause a war between these two nations. And so a prophecy about the end times does not mean that you want to kill everybody who ever belongs to a religion throughout all time. That's a very strange and distorted way of looking at a prophecy. The prophecy is simply telling you a fact that before the end of time this will happen. But for whatever reason, maybe what's happening now, whatever reason, a war will happen between a Jewish nation and a Muslim nation, and that's how it's going to end. A prophecy doesn't mean hatred, a prophecy simply means something's going to happen. And so, again, be careful of the framing. It really just comes down to how people word things. Sometimes someone can speak a truth, but they can speak it in such a distorted way that they make it look evil. You have to be careful with your choice of words, and when people are using the wrong choice of words, you have to redirect them to the correct choice of words. So our religion is not against any specific group in that way, right? We believe there are believers and there are disbelievers. We don't discriminate against any specific group of disbelievers. We do da'wah to all of them. We want all of them to take their shahada. We want all of them to convert to Islam. We want all of them to go to Jannah. We want good for people. There's no specific group that we discriminate against. If a Jewish man converts to Islam, he's treated the same as any other Muslim. If he doesn't convert to Islam, he's treated the same as any other non-Muslim. Right? There's no specific hatred for a specific group. So be very careful of how people take these incidents in our history or these prophecies about the future and twist them to make it sound like we are this violent, angry group that just want to kill people. This is not true, and our history is proof that this is not true. And the teachings of the Quran are proof that this is not true. And the Sharia is proof that this is not true. Because if this was true, why did the Sharia give so much rights to the Jews? And why was this applied consistently to every Muslim empire, from the Khulafa al-Rashidin to the Umayyads, to the Abbasids, to the Ottomans? They all consistently applied this set of rules of protecting the rights of Ahlul Kitab. And that itself is proof enough that they are lying when they call us anti-Semitic. We ask Allah to allow us to speak the truth and to be voices of the truth and to make the truth clear to all. We ask Allah to protect the people of Palestine, to liberate them, to free them, to grant them justice and to grant them victory. And we ask Allah to remove the oppressors and the tyrants from the Middle East and to replace them with righteous rulership. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّكَ رَبِّ الْعِزَّةِ عَمَّا يَصِفُونَ وَسَلَامٌ عَلَى الْمُرْسَلِينَ وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. أقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر.